Since the Cincinnati Bengals hired Al Golden, we've got updates on Trey Brown's GM candidacy in New York and some more details about the coaching staff. Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapine, and we are Locked On Bengals on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. Today, we're going to dive into what's been going on with the Bengals since Al Golden became their next defensive coordinator, updates on Trey Brown, some of the defensive coaching staff, hires or retentions in some cases, and there's a lot to catch up on, James. We haven't talked for a few days. They hit us with the news late on Wednesday, was it? And so we did a double recording that day, and now we're back with the people. This episode brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl right around the corner, just a couple weeks away. And with your $5 bet with FanDuel, if you win, you'll get $200 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. And let's get started with Trey Brown news, James. There was a lot of chatter, at least in my replies on social media, when retweeting or following the Trey Brown Jets GM candidacy, that was actually a little disappointed that he didn't get the job. And there's two sides to it, obviously, but the Bengals in line for a couple of comp picks when and if Trey Brown does get a general manager job, which feels inevitable to me. It seems like it is coming, and his time will arrive, but he will stay in Cincinnati, at least for now. I guess there is still technically one GM job open, but as of now, the job he was a finalist for went a different direction.
Yeah, they didn't hire Trey Brown in New York, and I think that there were a lot of people around the league that thought he would get that job. And I think people within the Bengals organization that were kind of preparing themselves that he was going to get it. And so he was one of three candidates, I believe, to interview twice. But this was a search that was reported as over, and Trey Brown wasn't getting the job on Friday, according to Josine Anderson. And then it went into Friday night and into Saturday. And then finally it came to a resolution. But yeah, I think it's twofold, because Trey Brown is obviously not part of the Brown family, for those that don't know. And I get why you would think that potentially. And so having that outside voice in the front office, having someone that isn't one of the head scouts, right? And whether it's Steve Radisevich or Mike Potts, two guys that have both been on this show. Trey Brown has also been on this show. I think there's value, especially in this front office, where we know that they're not going to have the biggest scouting department in the league. That's just never going to be the case with the Cincinnati Bengals. And so having a guy like Trey Brown, I think, does help. It does help Duke Tobin. It does help in free agency. It does help give a different perspective. And at the same time, I think people saw it and said, man, a third-round comp pick this year and a third-round comp pick next year, that would be nice. And so the back and forth there, I'm not sure if one is far superior than the other. I will say this: if the Bengals have a huge, awesome, amazing offseason, and Trey Brown's a big part of that, then I'd much rather have Trey Brown than a couple comp picks. But I also get the other side of it for sure. And so we'll see how valuable he is, and we're probably going to say this every year of the Joe Burrow era until they win a Super Bowl, but the most important offseason that I can remember.
I think it's not necessarily until they win a Super Bowl. It's until they are in a place where they're not desperate for players at so many positions. Like last year and this year, they had so many important decisions to make at so many different decisions, or so many different spots. But we don't need to get too far down that rabbit hole today. It's going to feel that way, I think, whenever there are critical decisions to make. And if Trey Brown is in demand for GM jobs year after year, some people are asking why. Like, what have the Bengals done when Trey Brown has been in Cincinnati? They've drafted poorly. They've missed on a couple free agent classes recently. Like, why do people want this guy to be a GM? And one, it's more than just what the Cincinnati front office has done or what's happened with those players. He goes back and he's been to a Super Bowl with three different teams, while in the front office, going back to New England. He did it in Philadelphia. He did it with the Bengals. He was part of the front offices and went to Super Bowls with each of those teams. And that's attractive, I think. On one hand, he has experience working with Howie Roseman. He has experience working with Bill Belichick and building championship level rosters in New England and in Philadelphia and in Cincinnati when they went to the Super Bowl. And then they went to an AFC championship game. So that part of his resume, I think, is impressive to other teams. And when you have a guy like that in your front office and the role that he's in, I think that we should probably see that as a pretty valuable piece of the front office. Even if we don't know exactly what the division of labor is, we know that the Bengals have a small department. And I think that's another point to talk about. But I think, given his popularity on interview circuits the last couple of years, and like I said, the inevitability for him to get that big job that feels like it surrounds him, should probably see that as an asset for the Bengals front office. Mm-hmm. And so when you're comparing 2 third-round comp picks versus this guy who's a really hot GM candidate, should probably be seen as something of a positive that they kept him. On the other hand, if you're the Bengals and you see this coming, and now you should certainly see this coming, especially after this year, you should build some redundancy around that position. Maybe they feel like they have it, but as far as I know, they haven't hired any additional personnel department executives or whatever to kind of backfill for whatever position. Maybe they promote one of the head scouts to that position, but then you need somebody to step into the head scout position. So like, again, we're talking about expanding the scouting staff, right? Especially at the top end, like have the guys ready to ascend. So you're not caught in January losing a key piece of your front office when you're about to have to get through the entire offseason process.
Yeah, with no backup plan. Right. And it's one of those things, like we've talked a lot about the search, the defensive coordinator search. Well, Zach Taylor has had to sweat out Lou Anarumo possibly leaving for a couple of years, right? And thought that, he's definitely going to get that Arizona Cardinals coaching job. You got to have a backup plan in place. And I think Al Golden was probably that plan even way back then. And have that, whatever it is. And maybe it isn't in-house. Maybe that person, that candidate that you want to hire is happy with their job and is only going to take a promotion and all of those things. So you can't necessarily hire them now. But to your point, have the plan, and it's not going to hurt to add another body in that room, in that front office, in that scouting staff. If it is a scout, if it is someone, because you're right, they may elevate a Mike Potts or Steve Radisevich and go that route. I wonder, I don't know in the pecking order how that is. Like Steve handles a lot of the pro stuff, as we know, and Mike obviously handles a lot of the draft stuff. And so it's like, all right, well, is the Trey Brown role something they want, or is their next step GM anyway? I don't know. I don't know exactly how all of that is and the exact structure behind the scenes. The point is, and your point, and I think a lot of people will feel this way, it wouldn't hurt to have another body and have another NFL expert in that room to help with everything that comes along with being an NFL franchise and getting it right in not just this offseason, but every offseason. So I ultimately agree with you. I think Trey Brown probably at one point this week thought he was getting that job and would have been ecstatic to get it. But I do also think that given the interest that he's commanded over the past couple of years, given how the league views him, it's just a matter of when he becomes a GM in this league.
Yeah. I wonder if they, like I said, have a succession plan for like a Christian Sarkisian or Andrew Johnson, who are the other two scouts listed on the Bengals front office roster to round out their 6-person personnel department with 4 senior executives and a couple of scouts.
How many?
I wonder. 6 total. You'd be losing 1/6 of your personnel department. And I get it. That happens. Like guys go and become GMs elsewhere. It happens to good teams. It will eventually apparently happen with Trey Brown. Unless the Bengals promote him. Maybe Duke's going to, I don't know. No sign of that coming, but that would be another path.
What are you doing? Look at you.
Saying, there's a guy. The Bengals love promoting their own people.
I'm not saying that. I just People are going to say, yeah, get Duke out of here. You know how social media is. They're going to be like, get him out of here.
People want change for the sake of change sometimes.
Sometimes. And
I'm not
sure
that they're totally wrong.
I'm sure there's a Duke conversation we can have at some point, for sure. But we do have to talk about a guy that is staying, even though Duke is probably staying too. There's a cornerbacks coach that is staying as Zach Taylor's coaching staff continues to take shape on the defensive side of the ball. We'll get to that coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn. As a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5 or 6 or 7. It's around the clock. And your business is always on your mind, which means it's time to hire the right partner, the right people that are going to be able to help you succeed. Whether you're looking for a scout or whether you're looking for someone with the expertise that you need to help run your small business, post your job with LinkedIn's new feature that can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job up in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip. Add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Again, that's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Charles Burks will be back with the Cincinnati Bengals to coach the cornerbacks, James. And there was interest. I think you reported this from Lou Anarumo in retaining Charles Burks, bringing him with him to Indianapolis. But, well, you can tell this story. This is your news. You reported this. He ends up staying in Cincinnati.
Yeah. Charles Burks had interest across the league. But Indy certainly was interested. I think there were multiple other teams interested. The Bengals keep him. His contract was up, which I didn't realize. And so it was one of those things where from the jump, the Bengals wanted to keep him. And early on, I think before Al Golden was officially announced, all of those things made that clear. He met with Al Golden last week. Things went great. And Charles is back, and it goes by Chuck, of course. But yeah, I think another one of those things where I think on the surface, people are going to say, man, the cornerback stunk last year. Why would you bring him back? One, I'll say this. It was a priority for the Bengals really from the jump. Al Golden really wanted to keep him. And two, I think he had multiple opportunities and maybe even more with the coaching cycle still continuing in the weirdness since he made that decision, whether it's the Dallas Cowboys, the Raiders, there are some teams out there that I think would have been interested too. So really good get, I think, in what the Bengals need is a cornerbacks coach that is going to get the most out of the guys in that room, because they've invested a lot in that room as far as draft capital goes. And it's not like we look at the cornerbacks and say, oh, well, that's one of the best position groups on the team. It doesn't feel that way right now. And so big job for Chuck, big job for the Bengals to get that room headed in the right direction.
Yeah, and hopefully that is the right decision, of course. Positional coach is only part of the puzzle there. You look at the cornerbacks on the whole and you think, well, they don't feel great at that spot despite all the draft capital invested there, but you do still have 2 second-round corners and a first-round corner to work with, or, well, I guess corner now. First-round defensive back at the time, corner now in Dax Hill, DJ Turner, and Cam Taylor-Britt. And you got something pretty productive out of Josh Newton as a rookie for a mid-round pick. I think that everyone can look at that, or late-round pick. Everyone can look at the Josh Newton selection and say, they got something there that can be a serviceable part of this team for that rookie deal. You got a deal potentially with the transition out of the Mike Hilton era, and figure out who are your starters going forward, because it does feel like we're on our way out of the Mike Hilton era in Cincinnati. Probably a bit more of a conversation that we could have around Mike Hilton's name. That's just the general feeling at the time. But there was some development for DJ Turner from year 1 to year 2.
Yep.
I think everybody that watched him would agree with that. Dax Hill was more than a viable corner option in this transition, and we didn't get to see a full season from him. Cam Taylor-Britt certainly had his ups and downs this year, but for the most part, he bounced back from what was a terrible middle part of the season to kind of finish with an overall performance that we've seen from him before. Got through the entire season playing 350, 400 more snaps than 2023, and they got to get him back on track, obviously, but it wasn't all bad. If you're lumping Burks into defense bad, coverage bad, corners bad, Cam Taylor-Britt bad, I think that's ignoring some of the good things that we saw last year in terms of development from these corners as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. The more I think about it, the Dax Hill element of this, and the Dax deserves a ton of credit, and people know I've been bullish on Dax from the jump. I think that there might be one person in that building more bullish on Dax than me, and it's Chuck Burks, a believer in Dax Hill. And so to see that switch, that light bulb go on the first preseason game, and he just takes off and leaves DJ Turner, who's probably the fastest guy on the team, in the dust, one of the fastest guys on the team. It's a testament to all involved, but certainly Chuck deserves a ton of praise for that. And I was thinking about one of Dax's, and I forget which game. The season is such a blur, but Dax had a really good game early on, obviously before his injury at cornerback, made some big plays, and was part of why they won. So you think about it. I mean, the wins were few and far between.
There's one game that could be.
What was it? Was it Carolina?
Yeah, there's one game it could be if Dax played in it and they won.
Maybe it was a preseason. Maybe it was preseason then when he was still ascending. But it had to have been because Carolina was on the road. So he made some plays in one of these preseason games, and Chuck came by, and you could just see how proud and happy he was that Dax was starting to figure it out. That would align because you didn't know if Dax was going to start or not. And that's what you need. You need a coach that can maximize Dax, that can maximize DJ Turner, that can get the most out of a Josh Newton, who clearly has the want to and the desire and the work ethic, and they handle business the right way. Like a lot of these guys do that. So how do you get the most out of them? You have to have the right coach. And much like you said with Trey Brown, with the interest across the league, like I can only say so much there. I don't even know. Anyways, yeah, I can only say so much there, but there was a lot of interest in him. And there's not a scenario where he was not going to be a cornerbacks coach this year in the NFL. There's not one. So clearly he's held in high regard. And hopefully, like you said, it's the right decision. And hopefully they give him a bit more to work with, whether it's in free agency or the draft. I think they're probably going to add a piece to that cornerback room. That doesn't mean 5, but a piece. And whether that's in free agency, whether that's an early pick, I'm not sure. But certainly one of the many questions, I would say, about this defense going into the offseason.
Yeah, much more so because of the way Dak's season ended, the injury that he'll be returning from. If we didn't have that to talk about, then we wouldn't probably be talking as much about an investment at corner, because you'd have 4 young guys that are your top 4 in the rotation, and it would be filling out the back end. And that might be what they end up doing if Dax is recovering really well. We don't know the answer to that question yet. And James, you're probably thinking of that first preseason game against Tampa when Dax was targeted 4 times. He had 3 pass breaks, according to PFF charting. He threw in a defensive stop, in addition to those 3 pass breakups. So on 33 snaps, giving up 1 catch for 28 yards with 3 pass breakups is a pretty good day when you're getting that much production.
That was probably it, especially because he was the backup going into that game.
Yeah.
DJ Turner was ahead of him. So it was probably that game. Good call.
He played 33 snaps in that game. DJ Turner played 11 in the first preseason game. And then after that, they tried to continue the competition, and both guys started in week 2 and played 6 snaps each. And that was it for them in week 2. But at that point, it did feel like it was kind of decided. So coach kept there, and we're still waiting for some of the rest of the defensive staff to come into shape. And we know a little bit more about Jerry Montgomery, who the Bengals will be bringing in to coach the defensive line in part, in whole. Based on his track record, I wonder if there is a pass rush specialist coming along as well. We'll see. We'll talk about that a little bit. So we'll finish the show with a few more notes on Jerry Montgomery coming up next.
Super Bowl 59 is almost here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And as we record this, Championship Sunday hasn't kicked off yet. But whether it's Championship Sunday, whether it's Super Bowl 59, you can get in on all the action with FanDuel, because FanDuel is going to have all of the different options that you need. And they're going to make it as convenient as possible. So you can say, oh, I want to do 3 different same game parlays for the Super Bowl, or I want to combine an NBA game and parlay that with the Super Bowl 59, or I think that this player is going to certainly win the MVP. Regardless of what you're thinking, regardless of what you want to wager on, FanDuel is going to have it for you. And right now, if you bet $5, you'll get $200 in bonus bets when you win that $5 bet. That's right. Your first $5 bet, you win that, and you'll get $200 in bonus bets. So download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59.
James, the bit of additional information that we've learned about Jerry Montgomery since we first learned about the hire is that he actually spent more time with defensive tackles than anyone else when he was in Green Bay, which is a lion's share of his NFL coaching experience. Green Bay did eventually actually bring in a pass rush specialist to work with their edge rushers a little bit more. And it's unclear to me how much Montgomery actually worked with guys like Rashawn Gary, who was the primary or one of the primary pieces of conversation that we had around the hire when we first talked about it, and we had some initial reactions thinking about the Rashawn Gary Miles Murphy comparison, thinking about rebuilding a defensive line that is going to need 2 defensive tackles at least, if not 3, need a couple of edge guys at least, if not more. And you've got Trey Hendrickson, and you've got a couple of young guys on the interior, and you've got Miles Murphy, and you've got a bunch of questions on that defensive line right now. And so that is Jerry Montgomery's job. Kenny Clark, I was told by Peter Bukowski, who does Locked On Packers, absolutely loved Jerry Montgomery, and those guys certainly are tied together from a development perspective, and Kenny Clark becoming the force that he became in the NFL. Of course, Mike Daniels, former Bengal, has a connection with Jerry Montgomery as well. But I do wonder if there's a pass rush specialist coming, but a big part of this rebuild for this Bengals defensive line is, one, getting perhaps starter level play from your 2 second and third round draft picks in 2024, or finding pieces to complement those guys, because as we know, the defensive tackle room is a rotational room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that to me. This to me is the biggest question, and it makes sense that you bring in a fresh face of that room, and you have to find a way to get more pressure. Part of why the corners were so bad last year at times is because you just can't get pressure, and that's a tough spot to put any secondary in. So they have to figure that out. They have to be able to develop, and because there's this idea that, oh well, they take the best defensive lineman at 17, and it's like, nah, bro, I don't know. Like, yeah, it seems like it's a pretty deep defensive tackle class. It doesn't mean, and you're going to see a lot of mocks that they do that, but that's not the only spot they're going to look at. And obviously, you know that. And so Jerry Montgomery, whether he gets his first round piece or not, has to maximize what they have and get the most out of it. And I do think Chris Jenkins Jr. is going to be a good NFL player, but he's got to get there, and he needs people coaches to help him. I think he has the want to. I think McKinley Jackson did flash a little bit and might be a real piece here, but it has to continue. And obviously they have to add more pieces. I'm not saying go bank on both of these guys going into year 2 and some development and thinking like that's it. But what you do have, you're not starting. The cupboard isn't just completely bare. You need someone that's going to get the most out of these guys. And when you're talking about a first rounder in Miles Murphy, a second rounder in Chris Jenkins Jr., a third rounder in McKinley Jackson, Clearly, they saw something in all three of those guys. You need those guys to be key pieces this season, not at some point, not down the line. All three of those guys need to be contributors this season, and that's in key contributors, and that's what Jerry Montgomery is tasked with. And who knows, maybe they add another piece in that defensive line room. Wouldn't be from a coaching standpoint, wouldn't be mad about that at all if they do. Maybe I'll go and bring someone from Notre Dame. Wouldn't be shocked by that, right? But regardless of who it is, it doesn't matter. You got to get the most out of the guys that you already have.
Got to find another BJ Hill trade, perhaps, and maybe they're drafting. Maybe they're drafting a guy. It doesn't seem. I think it is just a straight up strong defensive tackle class, especially early. I think you're going to see multiple defensive tackles picked in the first round. Certainly, the first 2 rounds this year, compared to last year when we're talking about nose tackles. We're like, yeah, there's a bunch of guys you could pick in the 6th round, and they're probably roughly equal in terms of where you would hold them in esteem. You just pick your favorite flavor, but they're all the same kind of snack at that point. 6th round
I'm
snack.
hungry. You
Yeah,
got,
me
a
too,
got a
man.
little food for me?
Me too. I am very curious though, because BJ Hill by far their best interior player last year.
Mhm.
Also played the most snaps
Yep.
on the defensive interior for them last year, despite dealing with some injuries, because everybody dealt with some injuries. McKinley Jackson started the year on IR. Chris Jenkins had the thumb. So a huge amount of snaps to replace on the defensive line. 2 veterans to replace. They did not get what they were hoping for from Sheldon Rankins, obviously. And so even if you're hoping for Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson to be viable pieces, starters level players, whatever it is, you still need something to supplement. You cannot 100% cannot go into next season thinking, oh yeah, Jerry Montgomery's an awesome coach. He's going to turn Chris Jenkins into BJ Hill and McKinley Jackson into DJ Reader, and everything will be fine. We can just get some young guys to supplement that. Nah, that's not how it's going to work. I mean, if it does, awesome, but that cannot be your plan, right? You can plan to develop guys, but you cannot like put all of the marbles. It can't be all the marbles. I'm crossing up my metaphors now.
You cannot bank on those guys with marbles. I agree.
That's right.
No, I'm just
Can't
kidding.
take those guys to the marble bank, man.
That's right. I think it's so. Bengal Sands wrote something on BengalsTalk.com breaking down all of the McKinley Jackson snaps in his rookie year, and he said his high end could be Larry Ogunjobi. And to your point, that would be great. You can't bank on that. You can't bank on Chris Jenkins to hit his high end, whatever that is. Maybe that's souped up BJ Hill and on an even better level. Who knows? But you can't bank on that. And I expect this to be a position they address in free agency and the draft, because you need bodies. You can't be calling Lawrence Guy in week 3. Like, hey, Lawrence, please save us. Like, think about that. Like they had to give him a ton of snaps, and then he got cut by mid-year. That
And
cannot
Zach
be.
Carter was playing Lawrence
Zach
Guy
Carter
played 90 snaps. Zach Carter played 150 snaps in 4 games.
And so the other element here is obviously the evaluation to tie our entire conversation together. And so whether it's Trey Brown, whether it's Al Golden, whether it's Jerry Montgomery, you better evaluate these guys properly. You better vet out the veterans like a Sheldon Rankins, who is on his 3rd team in 3 years. Maybe there's a reason why, right? And so, and by the way, the Texans really wanted him and they were trying to keep him. So it's hard to say with free agency, but it's also hard to get it right. And so you can't leave any stone unturned with these guys. You got to find the right guys and you have to get it right. It's why they went to back-to-back AFC championship games in 21 and 22. If they want to get back there, you better get it right in March. You better get it right in April. And evaluating defensive tackle, defensive line is going to be a huge part of that.
I would not be opposed to them adding a pass rush specialist or somebody to work with the edge guys as well. Even if it's like an assistant defensive line coach, the way we see with assistant offensive line coach. Let me ask you one quick question here, James, before we go. And you can tell me if you think there's anything to this or not. The Bengals have hired 3 coaches away from one of the worst teams in the National Football League in 2024. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Scott Peters, did a full episode talking about what we think is going on with him last week. Obviously, there's a longer track record to Jerry Montgomery than his year in New England. But what are your general thoughts? Or do you give any thought to the fact that these coaches come from New England?
Not really. I don't, because they were all there for this past year. It was that was such a weird year in New England and a weird staff and like offensive line wise, and I said this last week, they were talking about not playing their top pick at all because they were worried about the offensive line from a talent perspective. That's the nightmare. Like, that's a nightmare to have that discussion. And then on the other side of it, look, Jerry Montgomery, he might be good, but it clearly wasn't working at a high level in New England. But maybe he would have gotten a second year had they not brought in a guy like Mike Vrabel. Maybe Scott Peters would have gotten a second year had they not brought in a guy like Mike Vrabel, who clearly was going to bring back Josh McDaniels, who clearly had guys that he was targeting to build his staff. It's a tough situation. So, like, it's the same for Marion Hobby, for example. I don't know if he's a bad coach. Like, I don't know. It didn't work out here. Like Lou, do I think Lou's bad? No, it didn't work out here. I'm not sure if it's going to work in India or not, but I don't think that they should necessarily not get coaching jobs. So the fit matters so much. Who you pick matters so much. Like, Marion Hobby shouldn't get blamed for not getting more out of Zach Carter. It's Zach Carter. They shouldn't have picked him. It was dumb. Never should have picked him. Never felt like the right pick. And so there's a balance there, I guess. So I'm not like, oh my God, they're from New England, it's not going to work. Put it that way.
I think you got to look at the talent on both sides of the ball. Christian Barmore was hurt last year, and you look at the defensive interior players that played the most snaps for New England. You've got an undrafted free agent, you've got a 5th-round pick, and you've got an undrafted free agent. You got a couple undrafted free agents that have bounced around a little bit. One of them had been with New England for 4 years, but was on 3 teams in his NFL career, and a second-year undrafted free agent, and Davin Godchaux, who went from from Miami to New England as a 5th-round pick. So it's not like there's a wealth of talent on that defensive front in terms of pedigree in New England. And the one guy that had it, Keon White, 2nd-round pick recently, played pretty well for them. And so there's something to be said about the talent that you have available to you. There's also something to be said about getting the most out of limited talent. But when you're talking college free agents and guys off the street, I mean, we've seen in Cincinnati how hard it is to get a functional defense going when you're talking about that level of pedigree in the trenches.
Yeah, it's tough. Hopefully they got it right. I'm open to these guys. I also think that it's not going to be easy for any of them, because it's either developing guys and getting more out of guys that are part of why they fired a lot of the defensive staff, or on offense, it's maximizing an offensive line that's going to be asked to drop back a lot. And that's a tough position to be in.
None of these guys are part of a first-year coaching regime. This is like we've talked about Philly so many times, or I've brought up Philly so many times. This is a Philly kind of thing where you're in the middle of your contention window and you're trying to right the ship after a disappointing season. Really 2 disappointing seasons, but one of them we can chalk up to Joe Burrow's injury. But we're going to hear from Al Golden on Monday. So maybe you've heard from him a little bit already with the Bengals media, Bengals.com, Dan Horde's podcast. We'll hear from Al Golden on Monday as he meets with the media in Cincinnati for his introductory press conference. And Senior Bowl's this week, James. Is that right? Senior Bowl? The Shrine game going on? The All-Star games going on as it's time to start thinking about that draft a little bit more, James. Plenty to talk about this week here as we continue into the offseason on Locked On Bengals. Until then, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.